Further ado, comrades, I'm going to invite Dr. John Ostrick to give us his input. Dr. John, the floor is yours.
All right, so I've divided this presentation into three parts, basically the results, an analysis, and some recommendations. The results section is quite detailed. I've got quite a lot of information here. And then the analysis, I'm going to give a very brief analysis because I don't think I have all the answers here. And then recommendations, that's where I think there'll be some discussion. So the statistics that we've seen, this graph here is a graph that I produced in 2021, where I looked at the historical election results, and I made a projection that the next election would hit 40% for the ANC. And unfortunately, as we see, it turned out to be true. And it's a straightforward extrapolation. If you look at the previous election results, you can see the graph line goes directly downwards to 40. So it actually wasn't surprising for me at all. And in fact, when I posted this graph before the election, people were shooting me down and saying, no, it's not going to be that bad. And yes, it was that bad. So I think we need to pay attention to data science and how it can tell us things. So here are the results as we know. I'll get back to these figures in the analysis where you will see what these mean and what the different scenarios that can play out entail. All right, so if we look at this map of the electoral results, as you know, yellow is DA, green is ANC, and pink is IFP, and magenta, which is the dark pink, is MK. PA is the dark blue. So if you look at this map of South Africa very briefly, you can see that the DA is concentrated towards Cape Town and fades away from Cape Town. But wherever there's cities or predominantly white-owned land, you'll see it's yellow, and vice versa for the green. And then you'll notice in this picture that KZN is mostly pink and magenta, except you'll see that the bottom of KZN, it's got some green, which goes into the Eastern Cape, and then in the north of KZN, it's got some magenta that goes into Mpumalanga. And that obviously reflects the positioning of Sisulu speakers. Right, so this is the voter turnout. Now, this is an interesting graph because if we skip back to the results that I predicted, they look very similar. And I'm going to overlay them shortly. Right, you overlay them and you can see there's the election results and there's the voter turnout. What this means, I'll discuss a bit further. Right, and then on the issue of demographics, so this is a sample of Joburg's demographics from Stats SA. And you'll see that if you look at the suburbs, it's mostly white people. You can see their suburbs. CBD is mostly black people, and then the same for Soweto. And then in between, you'll see there's obviously so-called colored and Indian areas. And now, obviously, this is quite this does show some racial mixing, but however, the dominance is quite clear that it's still mostly white people in the north and mostly black people in the south. Now, why is this interesting? Well, if we skip forward to the electoral results map and then we overlay the two, it's the same map again. So we see that effectively, if you look at the north of Joburg, where the suburbs are, where it says JHB, that is white people voting for DA. And then in the South Soweto, we see the South is black dominated and ANC dominated. Interestingly, in the CBD, we see it's red. In other words, it looks like people in the CBD voted EFF. Right, so overlay those two, and you can see there clearly where they are predominantly black people in the CBD. It's EFF, but elsewhere it's ANC. Right, so now let's look at KZN in a bit more detail. So here we've got magenta, which is the dark pink, and that is MK. And then light pink is the IFP. And then if you look at this map, you'll see that where there is yellow, that's roughly where there's white-dominated cities. And where there is green, it's ANC. And you'll see that the ANC tends to be next to the yellow of the DA. So what this means is if you look at that area, you'll see that on the map of a city, you'll see where the city is positioned. The city will be positioned where the yellow is, And then obviously the adjacent township is green, ANC. So again, black and white, people are voting by race. But there's a bit more nuance here because obviously there's the pink and magenta as well. So here's a map of the towns in KZN, and you go back to the map and you'll see the green, the yellow that cuts diagonally across KZN corresponds to the motorway with the white-dominated towns, and then the coast, particularly the south coast, where you've got those yellow patches of the DA, that corresponds to, again, white-dominated towns. We'll overlay the two maps, and you see that's correct. So what this is telling us is white people mostly live in the cities, they vote DA, and vice versa. And then if we compare this to the map of the Ingonyama Trust, which is obviously your traditional lands, those correspond roughly to IFP. So if we overlay IFP and Ingonyama Trust, we see that there is a difference here, but I mean, you can see mostly most of the IFP lands are inside Ingonyama Trust land. So this suggests that there's quite a strong element of traditionalism of the people who vote IFP. This is a response I saw today from the so-called markets. This is from Seeking Alpha, which is a well-known stock trader website. And you'll see that they say, in the most recent election, ANC, which has been in power for whatever, finally faced rebuke, earning less than a simple majority. The election result is to us, meaning the markets, a sign the country's begun to acknowledge problems with the top political party. I wonder what they mean by those problems. In other words, this is a very good sign. So they're saying that it's good that the ANC has lost power. And then they carry on. In most developed markets, national politics has a small impact on equity returns. But in a less developed country like South Africa, reliable public services and rule of law shouldn't be taken for granted. So they're basically implying that the ANC is not good for service or rule of law. So we can see this as they say here, it's a huge step in the right direction to make the country more investable. So you can see that the so-called markets, in other words, Wall Street, basically are happy to see the ANC having lost some power. So here's the analysis of all these graphs and data that I've looked at. We can see that the turnout in part causes the decline. So if we look at go back to the graph of turnout versus voting results, we can see that it's roughly the same graph. And that shows that to a large extent, the reason we lost so much power is actually just because people didn't bother to come and vote. We've also seen that people vote by race because we can see a strong correlation between suburban areas, which are white dominated, township areas, which are black dominated, and ANC versus DA kind of voting patterns. And then in the case of KZN, we see that MK and IFP mostly got traditional and rural areas, whereas ANC and DA got mostly towns and townships. So in my view, it looks like that the reason MK was suddenly so successful and getting much more of the vote than, say, something much more established like EFF is simply because of the Jay-Z factor, right? So former President Comrade Jay-Z taking over the leadership of that party was a strategic move that let him effectively take control of KZN. People didn't really change their vote from ANC to anything else except MK. So if we look at the results and we add MK's share to the ANC results, so the 2019 result was 57%. But if we add MK and ANC from this year, we get 55%, which suggests that we only lost 2% to the disgruntled vote faction, but we lost a huge percentage to Jay-Z. So why is this the lowest turnout? Why do people still vote by race and area in 2024? Why do people vote for Jay-Z? And why are the markets rejoicing? Those are the 4 questions I want to address briefly. And here are the answers. So the first answer is that I think the triple challenges are preventing people from seeing meaningful change in their life. So people basically can't justify the cost of travel and time to go to a voting station if they don't see that it's going to help them in their daily life. So we and others keep promising jobs, and we don't really deliver. The oldest person who remembers apartheid is now about 23. And 45% of that age group are unemployed. So now, why should those people care to vote for us if A, they never knew how bad apartheid was, and B, they're unemployed, right? So you think about a person in that age group who never saw apartheid, never saw the horrors of it. And we now expect them to come to a voting booth and vote for us. Why? We've given them nothing as far as they're concerned. So it doesn't surprise me that the youth don't show up and don't vote. So the voting population declining is not so much people not showing up. I think it's a large proportion to do with people simply dying of old age or moving to other countries or things like that. Second reason, why do people follow voting by race? And my answer is I think people are still racist. So here's a classic sample from um, Rachadi Zilla, where she's saying that the apartheid state had effective, capable cadre deployment. Charming. Anyway, she said that on the 18th of January, 2 years ago. Yeah, so that's why people still vote for her, because they agree with her. Right, then the support for Jay-Z is the thing that I think we need to understand. We see that the rural and Ingonyama trust lands correlate with MK and IFP respectively, but only loosely. So it's not exact, but it's pretty strong correlation. And we see that towns in KZN are either DA or ANC, depending on demographics. Again, racial bias in the voting patterns. And then the third point that interests me is that apparently Zondo did not tarnish former President Comrade Jay-Z's image in KZN. So the question is, why did that not happen? And we saw when he got arrested for contempt of court, right? We had all those riots July 9th, 2021. And we see there was a response to his being arrested, and they were triggered by that. So we didn't take that as a warning, and we should have taken that as a warning when we saw the level of support that Comrade Jay-Z had. So the question for me is, why does he have that much support given what he's accused of at Zondo? Does it mean that in KZN corruption is not perceived as a big problem? Does it mean that his treatment you remember the infamous shower case, is that not perceived as a problem? And I think not. I think that's probably what we're not understanding is why that's not taken seriously, why it's not treated as a problem. And we need to understand that. So my recommendations follow. The first and most important recommendation is that we need to create jobs, and we need to discuss that. How did that missing 40% of voters disappear? I think it's got to do with jobs. And I think if we could get those 40% back into the ANC voting pool, we would be pushed up to near 80% of the vote. We would never lose power if we could get those people on board. The second thing we need to do is we need to understand the racial bias in voting. All right, so we've seen some Black people vote for ANC, and DA, and we've seen a large proportion of the colored population voting DA. We need to understand that. Why do certain groups and people who are mostly affluent vote DA? What is it about the DA that appeals to their thought processes? Is it just racism on the part of the white compatriots, or is it more complicated? Has it got to do with, say, individualism, or has it got to do with capitalism? These are various hypotheses we could come up with for why people would vote DA. So we need to engage constructively with the DA and not the DA so much, the DA supporters, and find out why they want to vote for an overtly racist party. And if we could onboard that group, we would then be heading towards 50% or 60%. But we'd need to obviously change their attitudes and views on things. Third point of the recommendations, we need to understand the support for Comrade Jay-Z in a non-bigoted manner. In other words, we need to understand what the voters see in him. Is it his leadership style? Is it his personality? What is it about Jay-Z that attracts an entire province? And how is the factionalism around him destroying the ANC, and what can we do about that? Is there a way to engage with him and or MK in a constructive way that doesn't involve onboarding some of their, shall we say, more controversial positions like anti-constitutionalism? So if we could succeed in getting those voters back, we'd have 55% of the vote. In other words, we'd be back roughly where we were in 2019. So if we look at the above recommendations coldly, it seems that the most powerful route is actually the jobs gains route. So we could actually omit dealing with our political opponents constructively if we could actually create jobs. However, I think there is benefit to engaging constructively with political opponents. On the question of the markets, it's clearly a response that that the Wall Street and similar think that a greater presence of DA, in other words, white politicians in government, would mean something more like a more investor-friendly policy of our government. And because we're short of job creation, I think it should be something that we should be positive about, in the sense that we should think of this as an opportunity to try and attract these investors while they're still expecting to see more white people, and say to them, look, please come and invest here, but bring job creating type investments. Don't just come here and buy bonds and stocks and mortgages. Rather, just come here and put up factories and similar. So we need to take the opportunity while the market is positive towards us to try and create more jobs locally, because for me, that's the most important thing. Fighting the battle of global socialism versus capitalism isn't something we're going to win like in this next 5 years. So I think we should focus on that. So those roughly are my recommendations and thoughts on this data and what it means. And yeah, I think it's pretty clear if you look at these results, what it means. So here we can see very clearly that Comrade Jay-Z took an entire province from us. And here we can see very clearly that the voter turnout is what knocked us over. So yeah, hence my recommendations. Engage the political opponents, try create jobs, and let's actually deliver something for the citizens so that they vote for us again. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for that detailed assessment of the outcomes. I think you've done a great job that has actually started to pose questions of interest that we really need to start taking into consideration.